The rains had come and gone, leaving Ibua village glistening in the aftermath of the season's final storm. Kwame wiped sweat from his brow as he dug through the mudslide that had uncovered something at the edge of the forbidden grove. His hoe struck something solid, the sound different from the usual stones that plagued his fields. "Ancestors preserve me," he whispered, dropping to his knees. The thing stared back at him from the mud, a mask unlike any he had seen in their village ceremonies. Its features were distorted, carved from dark wood that seemed to absorb the sunlight around it. Small shells and beads adorned its edges, and faded paint created patterns that made his eyes strain to follow. Most unsettling were the eyes, hollow voids that somehow felt full of watchfulness. Kwame's rational mind told him to rebury it, to pretend he had never found it. But his hands, acting against his better judgment, lifted the mask from its earthen grave. "It was hidden for a reason," came his wife Nia's voice from behind him. She had followed him to the fields, carrying his midday meal. Her expression tightened as she saw what he held. "It's a relic, Nia. Probably from before the colonial wars. It belongs in our village hall, not buried in mud." He turned it over in his hands. The inside was smooth, worn as if by years of use. "My grandmother spoke of such things. Masks meant only for certain ceremonies, masks that should never touch living skin." Her voice held an edge of fear that Kwame rarely heard. Nia was not a superstitious woman. "Tales to frighten children," he said, though uncertainty threaded through his words. "Elder Kofi will know what to make of it." But when they brought the mask to the elder's compound, the old man's reaction was immediate and severe. He backed away, making warding signs. "Where did you find this?" Kofi demanded, his voice trembling. "In the western fields, near the grove." "Take it back. Bury it deeper than you found it." The elder's eyes never left the mask. "It is from before our time. Before our people came to this land. But it is dead only while it sleeps, Kwame," Kofi hissed. "Would you wake it?" That night, Kwame couldn't sleep. He sat by the light of a lamp, studying the mask he had refused to rebury. Nia slept fitfully on their bed, occasionally murmuring in her dreams. The mask seemed to change under his scrutiny. The longer he looked, the more he could swear the patterns shifted, revealing new designs, new meanings. And in the deepest recesses of his mind, he began to hear something, a susurration like dry leaves against sand, words just beyond comprehension. Just once, he whispered to himself. To understand what it was for. He raised the mask to his face, hesitating for just a moment before pressing the cool wood against his skin. The world stopped. Then the whispering began. The mask fit perfectly against Kwame's face, as if carved specifically for his features. The initial coolness gave way to an unnatural warmth that seemed to pulse through the wood, syncing with his heartbeat. The whispering, once faint, now filled his consciousness, hundreds of voices speaking a language he shouldn't understand but somehow did. He tried to remove the mask, but his hands wouldn't respond. A strange paralysis had taken hold, not painful but absolute. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis receded. Kwame tore the mask from his face, dropping it to the floor where it clattered unnaturally loud in the quiet hut. "Kwame?" Nia stirred, sitting up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "Go back to sleep." The next morning, Kwame awoke feeling more refreshed than he had in years. The doubts and fears from the previous day seemed distant, childish concerns. He glanced at the mask, now sitting on a small table, and felt a curious affection for it. In the village square, people noticed the change in him immediately. His usual reserved demeanor had been replaced by a magnetic confidence. He spoke with unusual eloquence about the village's future, about changes that could bring prosperity. Several elders exchanged concerned glances, but many of the younger villagers nodded in agreement. Where does this sudden wisdom come from, Kwame? Asked Elder Kofi, suspicion evident in his rheumy eyes. Perhaps I've finally found my voice, Kwame replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That evening, when Nia returned from the river with the other women, she found Kwame wearing the mask again, sitting motionless in their hut. Kwame! She rushed to him, grasping his shoulders. Take it off. When he turned to face her, she froze. Through the mask's eye holes, his eyes had changed, the whites now webbed with dark veins, the irises an unnatural amber. I can see everything, Nia, he said, his voice overlaid with a hollow echo. What was, what is, what could be? She backed away. This isn't you speaking. It is more me than I have ever been. He removed the mask, and for a moment, his eyes remained changed before slowly returning to normal. He blinked several times, disoriented. What happened? The mask. It's doing something to you. Kwame shook his head. It's showing me things. Knowledge from before, secrets that were lost. That night, whispers plagued the village. Several people reported hearing voices outside their compounds, but no one was found. Children woke crying, claiming shadows moved against the walls. By morning, a strange tension had settled over Ibua. Kwame began wearing the mask more frequently, sometimes for hours at a time. Each time he removed it, he seemed to retain more of the other presence, his personality subtly shifting. He spoke of ancient practices the village should revive, of powers that had been forgotten. Some listened. Others watched with growing fear. And in her heart, Nia knew that whatever had awakened within the mask was spreading, reaching beyond Kwame, whispering to the whole village, sowing discord, feeding on fear, and growing stronger with each passing day. A month passed, and Ibua village was no longer the same. The changes were subtle at first, arguments erupting over minor disagreements, suspicious glances between lifelong friends, children speaking in strange cadences that mimicked the rhythm of Kwame's new speech patterns. Kwame himself had changed most dramatically. He no longer worked his fields, instead spending days wandering the boundaries of the village, whispering to the mask he now carried openly. At night, he would disappear into the forbidden grove, returning at dawn with his eyes gleaming and his body covered in symbols drawn in red clay. When he spoke, people listened with a mixture of fascination and dread. A small group had begun to follow him, mostly younger men and women dissatisfied with the traditional ways. They painted their faces with similar symbols and gathered at the edge of the grove, where Kwame taught them to hear the whispers too. Nia watched her husband's transformation with a heart growing heavier each day. The man she had married, thoughtful, kind, patient, was being consumed by something ancient and hungry. At times, she caught glimpses of his true self, moments of confusion or regret quickly smothered by the mask's influence. You barely eat anymore, she said one evening, placing a bowl of stew before him. Your body grows thin while your shadow grows long. Kwame looked at her with those changed eyes. Sometimes they remained altered even when he wasn't wearing the mask now. Physical hunger is nothing compared to the hunger for truth, he replied. The ancestors spoke to those who would listen. Why did we stop listening, Nia? Those aren't our ancestors, she countered. Whatever speaks through that mask was buried for a reason. He smiled then, a terrible smile that didn't belong on his face. Yes. Buried by those who feared power they couldn't control. But I can control it. That night, shouting woke the village. Elder Kofi's compound was ablaze. As people rushed to help control the fire, Nia noticed Kwame watching from a distance, the mask clutched in his hands, a look of satisfaction on his face. What have you done? She whispered when she confronted him later. What was necessary? He was turning the village against progress. Progress? Is that what you call this madness? For a moment, genuine confusion crossed his features. Then his expression hardened. You don't understand yet. But you will. The next day, Elder Kofi was found wandering in the forest, his mind shattered, repeating one phrase over and over, "The mask must feed. The mask always feeds." More villagers began to report nightmares, visions of a massive shadow spreading over the land. Children drew disturbing pictures of a faceless figure watching from the trees. Livestock went missing, only to be found days later arranged in strange patterns in the forest clearings. Nia sought help from the neighboring village, speaking to their medicine woman, Aduba. "The mask you describe is not unknown to me," the old woman said. "It is said to contain a spirit that was neither human nor ancestor, something older that feeds on discord and fear. How do I save my husband? How do I save our village?" Aduba's face was grim. "The mask must be destroyed in the same place it was created. But first, the spirit must be weakened by confronting the truth of what it is. And if I fail? Then it will consume everything, first the village, then beyond. Such spirits grow ever hungrier." When Nia returned home, she found Kwame waiting, the mask on his face. Behind him stood his followers, their eyes vacant, their faces partially painted to resemble the mask. "You seek to betray us," he said, his voice no longer holding any trace of the man she had loved. "I seek to save you," she replied, her fear giving way to determination. "And I will." The rains returned to Ibua, unseasonable and violent. Lightning split the sky nightly, and the ground grew saturated, turning pathways into muddy streams. The village itself seemed to be drowning, not just in water but in the miasma of fear that had settled over it like a shroud. Kwame and his followers had taken over the village hall, transforming it with symbols painted in clay and blood. They conducted nightly ceremonies where the mask was passed among them, each person wearing it briefly before passing it on, each receiving their own whispered commands. After these ceremonies, they would emerge with frenzied energy, implementing the mask's will throughout the village. Those who opposed them either fled or were subdued. Some simply disappeared. Rumor said they had been taken to the grove, where the earth was disturbed in rectangular patterns. Nia had gone into hiding, sheltered by a few villagers who had not succumbed to the mask's influence. From this underground resistance, she planned and observed, gathering what information she could about the entity that had possessed her husband. "The patterns," said Jomo, an elderly craftsman who had once made masks himself. "They're not from any tradition I know, but they speak of binding and feeding. This thing, it consumes the essence of those who wear it, leaving enough of them intact to serve as its vessel." "Is there anything left of Kwame?" Nia asked, her voice breaking despite her resolve. "I believe so," Jomo replied carefully. "Those who've encountered him say there are moments when his true eyes show through, when he seems confused or in pain." This small hope was all Nia needed. Working by night, she and her allies gathered the materials Aduba had prescribed: clay from the sacred river, ash from a lightning-struck tree, and blood freely given by those fighting against the mask's influence. Their plan came together as the village descended further into chaos. Kwame had begun constructing a massive effigy at the center of the village, a towering figure with the mask's features writ large. His followers worked day and night, bringing materials from the forest, speaking little except to relay cryptic instructions. One night, as Nia watched from hiding, she saw Kwame alone by the effigy. The mask was off, clutched in his hands. He stared at it with an expression of horror, as if momentarily aware of what was happening. His body convulsed, fighting some internal battle. Then, with shaking hands, he raised the mask to his face again, and the moment of clarity passed. "Tomorrow," Nia told her companions. "It must be tomorrow. I don't think Kwame can fight much longer." Their opportunity came with the new moon. As Kwame led his followers in another ceremony, Nia and 6 others approached the village hall. They carried torches treated with the special mixture Aduba had prescribed, flames that burned blue-green, said to illuminate truth. The confrontation was chaos. As they burst into the hall, the unnatural light from their torches caused the mask wearers to shriek and cover their eyes. The mask itself, currently on the face of a young woman, seemed to recoil from the light. "Bring her to me," Nia commanded, and two of her companions grappled with the woman, holding her still while Nia approached with her torch. As the blue-green light fell directly on the mask, a terrible sound filled the hall, not quite a scream, not quite a word, but something in between. The woman collapsed, and the mask fell to the ground, skittering across the floor as if trying to escape. Kwame lunged for it, but Jomo intercepted him, old but still strong. "See the truth, Kwame," he shouted, thrusting one of the special torches toward his face. In the strange light, Kwame's features seemed to separate, his true face beneath a shadowy overlay that writhed and recoiled. He screamed, the sound containing both his voice and something else's. Nia seized her moment, diving for the mask and capturing it in a clay pot prepared with the special mixture. The pot immediately grew hot in her hands, but she held firm. "Run," she shouted to her companions. "To the grove. It must end where it began." The storm reached its crescendo as Nia ran through the village, clutching the sealed pot against her chest. Behind her, chaos erupted. Some of Kwame's followers collapsed like puppets with cut strings, while others gave chase with inhuman howls. Kwame himself was nowhere to be seen. Lightning illuminated her path in strobing flashes as she reached the edge of the forbidden grove. The trees seemed to bend away from her, and the wind carried whispers that clawed at her resolve. "Give it back," the voices urged. "It belongs here. It has always belonged here." Nia pushed forward, following Aduba's instructions to find the heart of the grove, a clearing where no plants grew, where the soil was stained dark with ancient offerings. The pot in her hands grew hotter, the clay cracking as the mask within fought to escape. As she reached the clearing, a figure stepped from the shadows, Kwame, his face twisted in a rictus of pain and rage. But his eyes were his own again, flickering between clarity and possession. "Nia," he gasped, his voice his own. "I can't hold it back much longer. It's still inside me, even without the mask." "Fight it, Kwame," she urged, setting down the pot. "I need you with me to end this. What it showed me, what it promised." He clutched his head. "Power enough to protect our village forever, knowledge lost to time." "Lies," Nia said firmly. "It feeds on fear and chaos. It would never protect us." The pot cracked further, a sliver of the mask becoming visible through the fracture. Kwame's gaze locked onto it, and his expression changed, becoming hungry, desperate. "The ritual," Nia said quickly. "Help me complete it while you still can." Something in her words reached him. With trembling hands, he helped her dig a pit in the exact center of the clearing. Together, they mixed the remaining ingredients Aduba had provided, sacred clay, ash, and their own freely given blood. "If we destroy it," Kwame warned, fighting for each word, "part of me goes with it now. It's bound itself to me." "I know," Nia replied, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "But I would rather have part of you than none." The pot shattered, and the mask rose into the air, hovering before them. Its wooden features contorted, no longer a static carving but something alive and malevolent. The air filled with screams, not just one voice but many, the accumulated anguish of all who had worn it before. Kwame staggered, his body twisting as the spirit tried to return to him. "Now, Nia," he cried. She thrust the torch into the pit, igniting the mixture. Blue-green flames leapt up, unnaturally bright against the storm-dark sky. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the hovering mask and flung it into the flames. The clearing exploded with light and sound. The mask began to burn, but not like wood, it burned like flesh, charring and curling in on itself. Faces appeared in the grain, mouths open in silent screams, before disintegrating into ash. Kwame fell to his knees, his back arching in agony. From his mouth poured a black smoke that was drawn inexorably toward the burning mask. When the last wisp left him, he collapsed. The flames died as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving nothing of the mask but a fine white ash that the rain quickly washed away. The whispers were gone. The grove was silent except for the steady patter of rain. Nia crawled to Kwame's side, cradling his head. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, but his eyes when they opened were clear, fully his own. "Is it done?" he whispered. "Yes," she answered, holding him close. "It's over. The village will heal. As will you." In the coming days, Ibua village emerged from its nightmare. Those who had followed Kwame returned to themselves, carrying the shame and confusion of their actions. Some memories were lost, mercifully so. The effigy was dismantled, the symbols scrubbed away. Kwame recovered slowly. Something fundamental had been taken from him, not just strength but certainty. The experience had left him humbled, quieter, more thoughtful than before. But in this new quietness, Nia found the man she had always loved, perhaps even more deeply than before. Together, they worked to rebuild trust in the village, to heal the wounds both seen and unseen. And the Forbidden Grove, once a place of terror, was reclaimed. No longer forbidden but sacred, a place of remembrance, where the villagers would come to remind themselves that some powers are not meant to be awakened, that some whispers should remain unheard, and that the strongest magic of all lies in the courage to face darkness with an open heart and unwavering truth.